In the last video, and it is raining outside, so apologies for the noise if you hear rain. It is because it is raining and because we are in the UK. Again, I'm going to very quickly run through basically the antithesis of the last video, which is the arguments against the arguments I made in the last video, which were both for and against PMCs. So first off, we have the idea that it's historically common. A lot of historians agree that basically during times of war, civilians are contracted to do certain roles, that it's DDE effectively, that there is a certain intention but the consequence of harming isn't intended, and this is the sort of thing that gives, let's say, national militaries an ethical, not necessarily, governmental legitimacy or military legitimacy, but what gives them an ethical standing is DDE, the fact that they intend to protect their country, they intend to do good, they intend to make the world a better place, and in doing so they have to do harm. Both that and the sort of idea that the ends justify the means, and again, I would probably class that as a necessity, not sort of as it's seen in a devious Machiavellian way. In any case, the fact of the matter is that I don't necessarily think this holds up to scrutiny so much. I think it gives one ethical legitimacy, but that doesn't actually mean that one should be able to operate in the place of an actual army. The issues that often arise with this is that people say defence firms are allowed to do it and the army is allowed to do it. Therefore, if you sort of combine that and say that certain people are allowed to produce systems that do this sort of damage, that do extreme damage, and you give another organisation standing to operate in that sense, then it creates an issue. Now, the way we go about this, or the way we get around this, is by saying you could just add all PMCs to the territorial army. The fact of the matter is that might not necessarily be so good in practice, and what gives, let's say, certain larger military firms or defence firms, let's take, BAE Systems, Raytheon, that sort of thing, what gives them license doesn't actually translate to, the license to actively take lives with that equipment, which only the military employs, because one does need that governmental legitimacy, not just the ethical legitimacy. And so from an ethical perspective, let's just look at it from an ethical perspective, one could argue that the operation works that way, again, in theory. But the fact of the matter is, if one is concerned with ethics in that scenario, then the way to go is to join the military. A lot of people argue. Again, I don't actually think that's true. But nonetheless, that's what a lot of people argue. Secondarily, for the idea of the common war effort, that in times of war, actually, it's okay to give people certain roles that they wouldn't ordinarily have, particularly if they're working alongside the national military. Now, this is actually a pretty strong argument. The fact of the matter is people were paid a lot for this sort of stuff, that PMCs fulfill a similar role. And if they are working alongside military, it is raining really heavily. I'll have to speak up. If they are working alongside a military, then they have certain license to do so. And if, the government employs them in that regard, then they have license to do so. The fact of the matter is, the only real argument against this is the idea that armies, or at least, let's say, in the War on Terror, when PMCs were employed, they did it not necessarily for, the goodness of the cause. They did it out of necessity. They had to employ PMCs in order to function. So while they are doing it out of necessity, it's not something we want to employ in an ideal world, and the focus perhaps shouldn't be on promoting PMCs, but the focus should be on promoting a structure which can support the various systems of the military which allow it to operate as it should. Now, I actually think this is a really good argument, the fact that, they're operating alongside and by the authority of certain militaries, and that gives them legitimacy. But the fact of the matter is, that's all very well saying if you're operating with your own military, the military of the nationality you are with, or let's say what we might consider a legitimate military, the UK, the US, Spain, that sort of thing, a Western nation which has a strong hold on ethical procedure, which we can say has from our point of view, a brilliant, I guess, legitimate authority to make decisions like that, then that's all well and good. But if you are going and fighting for a certain paramilitary in Sierra Leone, or even the government in Sierra Leone, it's not as cut and dry as you may think. One can't necessarily claim legitimacy from that certain pathway just because someone forms a government, and often PMCs do operate in this example. That doesn't mean that one can operate alongside it. More than this, often they're not actually operating for nations. This is all if you're to say they are operating alongside nations, which they are often not. So that's a pretty good point. In regard to the effectiveness argument, the idea that, good soldiers go out and, preemptively strike, that's, you can't compromise the ability of somebody who's trying to defend their own lives to do the job as best they can. You can't cripple them. Well, the fact of the matter is we do lay down certain military procedures that say private citizens cannot do this. We, have distinctive combatant and non-combatant lines that can't really be crossed within the Geneva Convention, within a lot of international material, within a lot of national material, in fact. So, the fact of the matter is there are limitations that have to be laid down, and one can't merely say that because they are doing a job there shouldn't be regulation, particularly if one is to look at this as a business, from a business perspective, which, PMC proponents often say that one should look at it as a business when that favours them, and as a military when that favours them. The fact of the matter is that if one wants it to operate as a military, then it has to, fulfil certain responsibilities. It has to operate in unison with the national military. It has to have legitimacy, that sort of thing. But if it's not going to operate as military, if it's going to operate as a business, then there are definitely regulations that apply. One can't simply go out and do whatever they want if one is running a business. And there's a lot that falls under that. And the fact of the matter is, the reason this is so grey is that there is stuff that's not decided yet. The fact that there aren't necessarily regulations, the fact that there aren't necessarily clear guidelines or clear practices that we know will do the most good, that doesn't mean that one can operate in the absence of those. It means that one has to operate with the best set of values that one can. Be effective as possible within reason. You can be as effective as possible, but as we've said, we're not giving these PMCs, or we're not allowing these PMCs to operate large-scale bomber planes, that sort of thing, or intercontinental ballistic missiles, because they do not have the legitimacy necessarily to do that, and we haven't actually decided what legitimacy they have. So the fact of the matter is, we are limiting their effectiveness anyway. They agree that their effectiveness should be limited, and I think ethically, and from actually a realistic standpoint, we should agree that that is that's a reasonably good practice. I'm going to go through at some point, and my God, the rain is going out there. I am going to go through at some point an argument for actually why PMCs should be given a lot more ability to operate more heavy military equipment effectively and increase their capability. But I'm just, I don't agree with really many of these counter-arguments, but nonetheless, I think it's important we go through them. So in regard to against, there's the idea of the profit incentive of war, that PMCs fulfill a certain function, and the idea is that they necessarily propagate that. Well, the fact of the matter is that businesses operate in order to solve problems. So they are paid as long as those problems arise, but that's largely in contract. If you're to say that because they have a profit incentive of something that is negative, which all businesses do because they are solving problems, they are creating solutions, every single business is doing that, then you are to say that every single business is necessarily immoral because their incentive is basically profit through a problem. And I don't think that's right. I think that this argument is pretty rubbish. Thunder. And they're not necessarily propagating conflict. There is still a reasonable amount of oversight that continues even though they are largely not legislated against or with, or perhaps overseen in the same way that militaries are. The fact of the matter is, a lot of businesses operate this way, and that's okay. Pacifism, I don't agree with that. That is going to have to be a rather large argument, but the fact of the matter is that in very, very, very short format, it is a good to protect your country, to protect your family, to protect a lot of stuff. And so I don't necessarily think that pure pacifism is okay, even if you're living in a realistic world. Even if you're not living in a realistic world, the fact of the matter is humans do sometimes need conflict to grow. And if we are to say that there is competition, then there might be conflict, then there might be the need for even, I guess, a framework of defence, even if there is going to be no conflict. So the fact of the matter is that pacifism as it exists, the fact that that is associated with demilitarization, isn't necessarily a good thing and shouldn't necessarily stand to reason, but that's, an entire topic on its own. Also, we have the idea that these firms have a desire for profit which basically minimises their ability to make militarily high-value decisions. And yes, there is a Hoover and rain going now, so it's incredibly loud. This idea that if a firm needs 4 helicopters and they only have 2, that they're not going to buy those 2 more helicopters, that they're not going to get those 2 more helicopters because it's not in their profit incentive. Well, the fact of the matter is you could say this for a lot of stuff, that businesses do cut certain costs, but militaries do as well. Militaries also have budgetary decisions to make, and the fact of the matter is the desire for profit, the idea that they have to cut costs, is probably a good thing in perhaps a military point of view, because it means that you're doing the job as efficiently as possible. And if you talk about a lot of this stuff, a lot of the private facilities that are provided for bases when operating, let's say, in the war on terror, for PMCs, they're often better than national military stuff itself. So I think PMCs probably show less, if not, let's say just as much dislike for apologies, I'm struggling to get my words out. PMCs often spend more in these military campaigns for certain facilities, for the equipment that they're allowed access to, for chest rigs, plate carriers, that sort of thing, than militaries often do, because militaries have a pretty tight budget. That's no secret. That's just fact, really. The next one is that we effectively shouldn't be allowed to sell these sorts of services. There's a reason we employ certain laws nationally and internationally that people, let's say in the UK, I'm not just allowed to go out and get Kalashnikov from down the street, when in a lot of other countries that they're operating in, they can. The fact of the matter is, if you are going to, that's not a very good way to judge the argument as a whole, because it's to say that even if they are justified in their action, that they shouldn't be able to operate within the laws of the country they go to, even outside of our own country, and those certain countries have their own legislation. That is to say that every single national legislation around the world should be the same as ours. And we can say, perhaps we would like it to be, but the fact of the matter is that it's not, and that we have no authority. Whichever country you come from, I have no authority, no government has any authority to dictate the, limitations of laws outside one's country unless they specifically apply. And the fact of the matter is, if you're operating in the country, if you're buying in another country, and if you're not actually affecting your country in any way, shape or form, perhaps you should be able to operate in a manner which basically maximises capability. Now, I'm running out of time now. I don't agree with that last argument really at all, but nonetheless, I think it's important that you know it, and I need to finish before 15 minutes. So, finally, the idea that it takes people out of the army. Well, the fact of the matter is that actually people choose to leave the army naturally. They have other priorities often, and it's bringing people back into the fold, allowing that certain skill that they've built up through their years in the army to continue even after their effective retirement. and that is probably a good thing for the fighting force of the nation, and that's it because I'm out of time.